I have a story that shows just how backwards and upside down everything is, especially in Washington, D.C. Mark Esper, Raytheon VP and top lobbyist at Raytheon, was just confirmed as Donald Trump's new Secretary of Defense. At a time when the military-industrial complex and the greed of defense contractors already runs our foreign policy, the President of the United States picks a lobbyist and executive at a top defense contractor to literally run the day-to-day operations for the largest, most powerful military in the history of the world. Not only that, the Senate agrees with this and confirms him with a 90-8 vote. His literal job description was to persuade politicians to sign more Raytheon contracts. The way he views foreign policy is, how can I exploit this crisis to make Raytheon even more money? And this isn't me just wildly speculating. The Trump administration has already hired former Raytheon lobbyists. Last year, there was a story in The Intercept, and I'll put a link in the description box. And here's the title. State Department team led by former Raytheon lobbyists pushed Mike Pompeo to support Yemen war because of arms sales. I'm not going to read you guys the whole article, but I promise you that's not clickbait. At the time, there were people in the State Department who wanted the U.S. to end our involvement in the genocide in Yemen because the civilian casualties kept going through the roof and the amount of people who were dying from famine and lack of medical attention was out of control. These people in the State Department go to Mike Pompeo and insist that the U.S. stop assisting Saudi Arabia in their genocide in Yemen. Mike Pompeo then talks to the legislative affairs team in the State Department. The person in charge of the legislative affairs team is the former Raytheon lobbyist. And he literally argues against ending the genocide because it would disrupt weapon sales, including a deal for Raytheon missiles. That's a former Raytheon lobbyist working in the State Department. And that's not the only example of Raytheon lobbying for war and genocide to continue weapon sales. The Nation had a piece about how top defense contractors in Washington have made $5 billion in weapon sales because of the genocide in Yemen. That's what Mark Esper was lobbying for on behalf of Raytheon. To continue a genocide that has already killed over 90,000 children and has completely destroyed Yemen. More than half of the hospitals have been bombed and aren't operational. Half the hospitals in the entire country. There's no food in the country. There's a blockade that's keeping food and medicine from getting into the country. Now the Senate just confirmed Raytheon's top lobbyist to be Secretary of Defense and run the entire Pentagon and oversee the war in Yemen. A guy who was a paid professional warmonger for Raytheon is running the most powerful military in the history of the world while the military-industrial complex is already out of control. We're at war in 8 different countries. We're doing a shadow war all across Africa with our unconstitutional drone assassination program. How on earth could anyone think that putting someone as craven as Mark Esper in charge of the Pentagon's gigantic, unaccountable $730 billion budget and the ability to hand out no-bid contracts could possibly be a good idea? What makes it even more egregious is that many of those senators who confirmed Esper were right there in Congress and had a front row seat to defense contractors like Raytheon raiding the Pentagon and the Treasury in endless scandals having to do with the no-bid contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Still, 9 out of 10 senators see nothing wrong with this. We are in even more wars and giving out even more government contracts to defense contractors. If you aren't worried that Mark Esper's pro-war positions will lead to more people dying, which is my top concern, at the very least, you have to know that he's going to host the taxpayers with these no-bid contracts that he's going to give to Raytheon and all these other defense contractors. Okay, so here's the thing. My default position is to not assume malice or that someone is intentionally lying when it's possible that they're just ignorant and don't know what the fuck they're talking about or what the fuck they're doing. That's not the case here. My default position is that these 90 senators who confirmed Mark Esper know what's happening here. The gut reaction from any sane person to Trump nominating Mark Esper, someone who is a executive at Raytheon and top lobbyist for Raytheon should be a vicious and resounding hell the fuck no. At the very least, dozens of red flags should go up in your head saying this is a bad idea. But beyond that, I know for a fact most of them were in the House or the Senate during the constant scandals of no-bid contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they can't feign ignorance and act like they don't know about defense contractors running out the back door with taxpayer money. Defense contractors like Raytheon are suspected of flat out stealing billions of dollars in taxpayer money and defrauding taxpayers out of billions more dollars by overcharging for everything and all the other scams that they were running. Everyone who voted for Mark Esper is aware that defense contractors used the reconstruction of Iraq to get rich. They know about the billions of dollars wasted on contracts to build military equipment that weren't asked for and will never be used. They know that the military-industrial complex is real and that corporations who profit from war and stealing natural resources basically run U.S. foreign policy. They know that neocons like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence and war criminals like Gina Haspel and Elliot Abrams are calling the shots and escalating conflicts around the world at the behest of defense contractors. These senators know all this and still confirmed a Raytheon vice president and top lobbyist to be the Secretary of Defense. And to add insult to injury, the overwhelming majority of Democrats, almost the whole goddamn caucus, voted to confirm Mark Esper. This is what I mean when I say there's no opposition party. Esper is one of those nominees that Republicans should be ashamed to vote for. That's a pick so far outside what should be the bounds of sanity and debate that Mitch McConnell should be having a conversation about how he doesn't think that he could get 51 Republicans to confirm such an absurd, brazenly corrupt pick as Mark Esper. It should be sacrilege for anyone in the opposition party to approve a fucking Raytheon lobbyist as Secretary of Defense. The opposition party is supposed to oppose war and corruption. Instead, you have almost the entire Democratic caucus voting to confirm Mark Esper as Secretary of Defense because they think that Trump didn't have enough pro-war neocons running U.S. foreign policy. Chuck Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate, voted to confirm Mark Esper. There is no opposition party. There's the Republican Party, and then there's a party that goes along with what the Republicans want 90% of the time. The Democrats agree with Republicans on the most important issues, especially on foreign policy. Ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been 15 years and 18 years, the longest wars in U.S. history. Where the Democrats on ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they don't want to. They want to stay in there just like the Republicans do. The illegal drone assassination program, George W. Bush started it, Obama continued it, the Democrats are all for it. The unconstitutional mass surveillance of U.S. citizens, the war on terror, increasing the Pentagon budget and defense contracts. The Democrats are allegedly the opposition party, but when it comes to issues of war and foreign policy, oftentimes the Democrats are just as militaristic and corrupt as the Republicans. Nobody in their right mind can think allowing a war profiteer and literal pro-war lobbyist to be Secretary of Defense in a Trump administration already being run by warmongering neocons beholden to defense contractors is a good idea. All the senators who confirmed Mark Esper are either participating in the corruption or they're indifferent to the corruption. But no one's going to tell me that they think this is all above board. Then there's nothing to see here. This is all fine. There's no corruption. Everything's on the up and up. Also worth noting, Ted Cruz is full of shit. You guys remember a couple weeks ago, Ted Cruz said he was going to work with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on a lifetime lobbying ban for lawmakers. So Ted Cruz thinks lobbying is such a problem. He thinks the influence of corporate money in politics is such a problem. He thinks that the revolving door between industry and government is such a problem that he's going to work with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on a lifetime lobbying ban for lawmakers. But apparently Ted Cruz doesn't think that same logic applies to cabinet secretaries, specifically the Secretary of Defense. When it comes to cabinet secretaries, Ted Cruz believes they're immune from corruption. Not only does he think it's all fine and legal if they go lobby after they're out of government. But he also thinks it's perfectly fine to confirm a fucking lobbyist to a cabinet secretary position. So Ted Cruz is full of shit. He's a grandstander. He wants to look like he's with the majority of the country who sees a problem with the corruption in Washington, D.C. But when it comes down to it, Ted Cruz will vote for a fucking Raytheon lobbyist, a lobbyist for the weapons manufacturing industry, to be Secretary of Defense. Someone whose job was to be a paid warmonger, lobbying politicians to be pro-war, is now in charge of the largest, most powerful military to ever exist on this planet. And 90 senators said, yes, I agree with this. These are the current state of affairs in the United States. Every part of this story is infuriating and disgusting and corrupt.